Hello and welcome to the LENKER podcast, where we shun platitudes in favor of real business wisdom. I'm Matt O'Leary, and our guest today is Mark DuVal, President and CEO of DuVal & Associates, a leading law firm specializing in FDA regulatory affairs. Mark's worked in the medtech industry for over 30 years, guiding almost 1,400 clients through this convoluted world of FDA regulation. Honestly, you'll feel like you should have earned college credit from listening to this episode. If you're a medtech entrepreneur or really anyone in and around the industry, don't miss this. We delve into Mark's extensive experience with the FDA, discussing the evolution of the regulatory ecosystem and its impact on medtech startups. Mark shares some common characteristics of successful and not so successful medtech startups, along with a heaping spoonful of strategic insight. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the conversation.
I'm really excited to have you on the show today, Mark. As I've gotten to know you over the last half year or so, you clearly have a passion for helping medtech companies succeed. The area of expertise that you bring to it, regulatory affairs and dealing with the FDA, such a critical component to success in medtech, something that I think a lot of founders underestimate the seriousness and what's involved. And particularly since we just were at MedTech MVP 2024 earlier this week, and I actually heard you make a couple comments at different times during the conference. And I just saw that, people really respect what you have to say and that you have a lot of confidence in the experiences that you've had. And I see you as a real contributor and a thought leader. So really glad to have you in the show. Thanks for agreeing to do this with us.
Well, that is too kind of an introduction, Byron. I'll take it.
But for our audience that hasn't met you yet, can you just start by giving us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in the medtech industry?
Sure. I started out at a large law firm here in Minneapolis, and I was recruited to 3M, where I went and became the general counsel of their pharmaceutical and drug delivery systems businesses and 3 of the medical device divisions. Went to Europe for a better part of a year in charge of the healthcare lawyers. Then I came back to the States, to Minnesota, and I resumed my role. And then I've been recruited to Medtronic for about 5 years and went across town and became their head FDA and compliance lawyer. Did that for only 2 years, and then I decided to start my own law firm. It'll be 22 years in October, and I've been doing it ever since. It started out as Klipinski DuVal, a former partner who left and went to a larger law firm. I carried on and did DuVal & Associates, and here I've been, 1,345 or 50 clients later, somewhere in that neighborhood, and it's been a really fun ride.
Did the job come first and then regulatory affairs was the thing that came with the job, or was it you had an interest in regulatory affairs and that led you to the job?
Yeah, boy, as a general counsel, as a litigation lawyer is where I started, so I liked advocacy, let's put it that way. But when I went to 3M, I just became pretty well known in the general counsel of the pharma industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, being pretty well known for kind of challenging FDA a lot. And I started writing a chapter for a book. It was called How to Work with FDA, Tips from the Experts. And I wrote the chapter every edition, every time we renewed it every 3 years or so, how to persuade FDA to your position. And I was just very successful as an in-house lawyer with the FDA, and I became kind of well known for that. And I think that's why Medtronic was so interested in picking me up across town, and I did that, and just had a lot of fun. But then I just said, I don't really want to work for a boss anymore. And I think a lot of us who have done the big company route know that. We become refugees. And I started up my own practice. And, now we have biomedical engineers and lawyers. And at one end of the spectrum, we do submission work. And we do pre-submissions, and we help people go get their way through the FDA, get their product approved. And we became famous, I guess, or infamous for winning appeals. When other companies or other regulatory shops that are very good shops from around the country would get stuck at FDA, and they'd get a not substantially equivalent decision, or they'd get a failure to grant a de novo or a PMA, or FDA was leaning that way somewhere in the review process, and they knew they were going to go down, they would hire us. And we just started having a pretty good win rate. If we didn't win outright with the agency, we found a path forward that was very productive and palatable to both sides. So that based on that, but I kept telling CEOs, look, there are flaws sometimes in the submissions and the negotiations and the pre-subs that you bring to us. If you'd come to us earlier and let my biomedical engineers work on the file, at least contribute to it, if not do it outright, we can get you through the process without a necessity of an appeal. And we've never appealed one submission that we've actually done. I just recognized that with a client who asked me 3 weeks ago, have you ever had to appeal one of your submissions? And I stopped, I paused, I looked, and I said, no, we never have. It's always everybody else's. And so we get referrals from, the best regulatory shops in the country, MICRA and RQM Plus. We've even gotten some from Hogan Lavelle, a law firm who's a phenomenal law firm, very large law firm. So we've just become very good at what we do. At the other end of the spectrum, we do on sales and marketing stuff. I sort of really opened my doors based on that. I was helping people, give them very practical, cutting edge, sophisticated and creative advice on how to sell and market their products lawfully. And so we would examine and explore the contours of the food, drug, and cosmetic and what could they do. And my tagline became, and it was given to me by a CEO from EV3 at the time. I asked him if I could steal it and trademark it, but it was like, we help you be appropriately aggressive, yet compliant. And that's kind of how we counsel. And we want people to be able to push the edge so that they don't leave money on the table, but not foolishly so that they get in trouble. And so we've counseled in that space for a long time very successfully. But then we also would do compliance programs, set them up, and we do audits, et cetera. But we train a lot of national sales meetings. We train a lot of boards of directors, C-suite teams, and then middle management. So in the middle, we're doing a lot of working with FDA investigators and maybe modifications letters, et cetera. It's a fun practice. We love what we do. And soup to nuts, cradle to grave, that's what we do with the medical device world.
Well, with that kind of track record, it sounds like you've really learned how to play the game. The natural question would be, how has that game evolved over the years? How has the regulatory ecosystem evolved I think you've been doing this for 30 years?
That is a great question, John. So I think the FDA there's this inevitable gravitational pull towards wanting more data and more evidence. Sometimes for the FDA, I call it a scientific expedition without a destination. It's science for science sake. And they hire a lot of young reviewers who are 2-year biomedical engineers, usually with a PhD. So they want to apply their dissertation sometimes to your client's submission. And they get very granular and very siloed in how they look at things. And so we are constantly resisting that natural gravitational pull because it just is what it is. You hire more sophisticated people, you get more sophisticated questions, but you lost the generalist view. And the 510K program accounts for 4,000 product approvals a year, if you will, clearances they're called. The de novo might be 80, and the PMA program, we're lucky if it's 35 to 50. It's usually around 25. So when you expressed as a percentage, a large amount of our devices are going through the 510K program, and there's a reason, because most of them are somewhat Me Too. Although the FDA doesn't apply the 510K, it's safety and effectiveness in a comparative sense, not with a de novo or with a PMA. It's reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness in an absolute and independent sense. So you're really, really proving things from the beginning with a de novo or a PMA. But with a 510K, you're inheriting this underlying regulatory presumption that the predicate in your predicate family is already established the essential safety and effectiveness of these products. So with FDA is more and more getting the 510K program to be the difference between a PMA de novo and a 510K are shrinking because FDA is asking for more and more, oftentimes unnecessarily so with a 510K. They're asking for what they want, not what they need. So that's been sort of the evolution. The FDA has made the process of working with them much better. They are much better to work with. But FDA has actually elongated the timeframes because they can hide behind the fact that they get you involved in pre-sub purgatory, doing endless pre-submission loop cycle, and then you submit your submission, and then they get on the clock and they get measured by Congress. So they're really good at playing the clock. They always have been. They always will be. No matter what we set up to try and measure them, they will always find a way to do things off the clock to their benefit. And in fairness to them, products are getting a lot more complicated than they ever have. And there's a lot more combination products of drugs, devices, and biologics, and maybe a combination of all three. So in defense of them as well, these products are getting tougher to review.
What would you say is like the top two challenges that medtech startups face when dealing with the FDA?
I'd say a realistic view of the FDA. A lot of CEOs, and I heard this yesterday at the conference, they have this very Pollyannish view about dealing with the FDA, and they want to be their friend. And I am their friend. My stock and trade is my relationships there. Having said that, my job is to challenge them. And you're entitled to. There is not an upper management person at FDA who doesn't encourage you to challenge them, and they're very open-minded. They're a breath of fresh air, and I love when I go up there, because sometimes I get adult supervision at that level. Because when the review staff makes decisions, sometimes they circle their wagons around one another and protect the original position. So I think that's number one, is they can't be Pollyannish about that. Nobody's going to advance their file just because you're trying to go along to get along. You can find yourself when they know that you're accepting what they do, they will continually push for more. And you have to be able to call the question. You have to be able to arrest the trajectory, et cetera. So that's the first thing, I think, is just not being Pollyannish about the FDA.
So let me put that in different words then. So what I hear you saying is that the company has more agency than they think they have when dealing with the FDA.
Absolutely. And what we try and do is oftentimes we start to set that position very early on for them. Sometimes we'll write, we did this very successfully with a large company, and now since that time 4 smaller companies, where we actually wrote a 10 to 12 page kind of opening, I'll call it a white paper, position paper on their submission. And we wanted to set the stage for the reviewer to right up front to know, here's why we think we belong, for example, on the 510K path. Or here's why the de novo data are sufficient. And we argue it through in a very respectful and straightforward fashion. But there's a lot of really good arguments already there, so that we set the tone. It says we're sophisticated, and we're going to try and hold your feet to the standard and not let you color outside the lines. And see that we really have some good arguments here for you to consider up front. We have been very successful doing that. You don't do it all the time, but the idea is don't let the initial decision be made of what pathway you're going to have and what's the quantum and the quality of data you're going to have to submit. You start leaning into that early and often with the reviewer, so that you kind of get your position set in it. And it really behooves you to do that. Otherwise, believe me, they can dream up all sorts of ideas for you on what data you should provide, or why you belong on the de novo pathway or PMA versus the 510K, et cetera.
So the agency challenge is the first. You said there were a couple. What was the second challenge?
I think that the second one is just dealing with the reality of their investors. And that is, the investors are constantly interrogating the CEO as to what the strategy is and why. And sometimes we're speaking to boards just to help the CEO sort of support or undergird the CEO's decision that's been jointly made with us as to where we're going to go and why. There's some very sophisticated board members, believe me, and there's some that are not so sophisticated. And sometimes either side can try and drive because they feel they know better, a different direction, or whatever, a different position. And so we, a lot of times, then also have to work with the CEO and the investors. We have to be very cognizant of if we suggest something that's going to take a longer timeline and more investment, of course they want to know that. If we're trying to do something that might truncate that because we're going to push harder, they might not like that because they want to go along to get along with the FDA. That's their natural propensity. So we just, there's many other things that you talk about, but I'd say those are the things you fight with the FDA, and those are the things you fight with the investors as you pursue the FDA.
So I've got a picture in my head of regulatory fair, this sort of early startup stage where the challenges we keep hearing about is that the regulatory fairs, the clinical strategy, the business model development, market access analysis, and the funding strategy, really, those gears, they fit together.
They do.
They should be designed alongside each other, and changes in one affects the others. So that's a picture that we believe it's true and promote. It's a hard thing to pull that off. So I wonder about, in your experience, when you say, your regulatory strategy, isn't it the case that some guys, they'll come with you with a reasonable regulatory strategy, but you think it's a little early? They haven't worked out the business model yet, really, or the market access strategy yet. And so that the regulatory strategy could change in 6 to 12 months or something as they make decisions along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of role do you think you should play in as a consultant or advisor when you see that happening, but it's kind of also outside your domain to consult on the market access strategy?
That is a good question too. Yeah, we encounter that on every file that we're on, and we typically will say a lot of CEOs today now know this, but in the early days especially, but now we're coming back to it again, where we're really encouraging CEOs to make the reg and the CMS strategy, one strategy in the sense that, CMS, the stuff the reimbursement people do are way different than what we do, but they're kind of similar in approach. But we need to start together because, for example, the quantum and the quality of the data we might want to submit for, a 510K or de novo might have a lot of utility in front of CMS when they're trying to seek reimbursement. So to that end, we've just hired a guy named Chris Lyle, who was from a really reputable, one of the best in class reimbursement firms in the country, JD Lyman. They happen to be out of Minnesota. JD Lyman Group. And Chris is a biostatistician by training and does evidence development. He occupies that space between what you need to do to get FDA clearance or approval and what you need to do to convince payers to cover your device. Coding, coverage, and payment are the three legs of the stool. Chris is phenomenally bright. I've known him for 25 years. He started out as a biostatistician doing a lot of supportive regulatory work. I use him because I always bring biostatisticians to the FDA to argue. We have to argue the FDA to stay in this box of science, medicine, biostatistics, policy, and law. And Chris does a really good job of helping me argue thematically the case why, our statistics support the clearance or the approval standard. So did you have a question, John?
Well, it just, it makes me wonder, in your experience, what percentage of the time do the founders of a med tech business properly calibrate the capital requirements to get through regulatory and really put a realistic timeframe and budget together and properly sequence when they need to be interacting with the FDA? What percentage of the time do they have a realistic picture, and what percentage of the time are they being way overly optimistic about how smooth the process will go and what it'll cost, and what are the extents of the different areas they need to spend on this?
I'd say 20% do it right and 80% do it wrong. They underestimate dramatic. Because I say, for example, I'd say you should, back to Kevin's question, you should spend a bolus of money up front, having the marketers up in the same room, with knowing what you begin with the end in mind. What is it you want to say your product can do or will do? You want the reimbursement people there, you want the regulatory people there, and you want the clinical people there to help design the study that'll help you attain all of that. Those people need to be talking to one another and talking to one another frequently. And that requires more capital up front and approached like that. You heard yesterday, John, one CEO, Mike Kuyak, from I'm trying to blank out on their name because they're a client of mine. I'll come up with it in just a second. But Mike talked about getting his CPT3 code right off the bat. And so
Right.
many people in that room were saying, how do you get the investors
Right.
to agree to do so, a lot of that stuff just to help you get the CPT3 code so that you can come back and do more data to get you the real code that you need ultimately. So,
Right. It's sort of like reverse engineering, the whole game plan, I mean, it's got to go through that code ultimately, right?
yeah, exactly. And by the way, the name of the company is Francis Medical. It just came back to me. The first iteration of that company was with Nexthera, and they got acquired by Boston Sci. And the next iteration of that technology now resides with Francis Medical, and they're going to be part of Boston Sci too, because they're the investor.
This is a really good segue into kind of what I hope the heart of our conversation can be today, because all that's kind of setting the stage for this. But I just asked about one success factor is your ability to really properly calibrate what it's going to take to go the distance with the FDA. And so the question I thought would be really interesting from your perspective, in your role, you're not in the middle of these companies, but you're closely connected. You have a lot of information and you can kind of observe and try to influence. In your 30 years dealing with, as many clients as you have, I think 1,340 some, what are the unifying characteristics of med tech companies that succeed, whether it's from a team standpoint or a technology standpoint? What are the things that the ones that succeed tend to have in common? And what are some of the red flag characteristics that make you go, oh my gosh, here we go again. These guys are going to really, really struggle.
Well, first and foremost, and these are the ones that get funded right away, is good leadership. There are times when it's a first-time CEO and they just have great leadership skills no matter what. But a lot of times it's serial entrepreneurs who've been there, done that. They've already delivered companies to the investors, and they've had a really nice exit. The leadership of a CEO makes all the difference in the world. Because first of all, they're going to populate their management team with really good experienced people. And if you get really good experienced people who've been there and done that, they kind of know the drill, right? They know how to work with the investors. They know how to deploy the capital and where they should be spending and at what time. Do we start out with our clinical? Do we start out with our regulatory? When do we start getting involved with our reimbursement? And there's a scarcity of resources up front as they do a Series A or whatever, or maybe an angel round at the beginning. And they just have to figure out how best to use the capital. The most important thing is getting a good prototype of the device and get it into an animal, or ultimately get it into a bench and clinical studies. So a good CEO is really on top of it. They sometimes are amazing how they stay on top of us in a good way. Say, hey, Mark, I need this product. I need your analysis. Can you show up at our C-suite meeting and just let's whiteboard what you're thinking or whatever? Or can you give us one of your people give us a regulatory assessment on where this product belongs and what predicates we could use, or whatever it is? Strong leadership and then a great team are key. That will attract all the rest. The financing, they'll get the attention. FDA recognizes good people too. See, small companies, when they go to FDA, are not like large companies. They have this Medtronic. When I was at Medtronic, we were Medtronic going to FDA, right? They just had this underlying trust factor and relationship, especially like in the cardiovascular and neuromodulation areas or whatever. But when you're a small company CEO, you're a refugee in one of large companies, and you're an unknown quantity to them. And believe it or not, FDA is inherently suspicious of you, or at least the young reviewers are. Like, you're out to make a quick buck at the expense of unwitting physicians and patients, kind of deal. And they really are kind of, when you listen to, I know I have a lot of intelligence at what people say at the lower levels of FDA about industry, and vice versa. I'm sure we say that about FDA. We just need to get to know each other better. Once you do, things go smoothly. But I'd say strong CEO, then enveloped around a really good team. The rest will follow.
Anything about the technology? Anything about
Uh,
simple versus complicated?
yeah, I guess I made an assumption that they found a good technology, and that's I guess another super important factor is, sometimes people get these Me Too technologies, and if you want a small return, et cetera, and hopefully quickly, that's fine. The more novel you get, the more difficult it's going to be. There's a continuum of novelty, right? You go down that continuum maybe halfway, and you're still pretty safe with the agency. You're not arguing too far afield from what they're really familiar with. But the further off you get, the length of investment and the time it takes to convince FDA of what it is it's going to take to get that product to the marketplace grows disproportionately. They're just unfamiliar. Everybody's unfamiliar with it, and you're even as a team, you might feel like the technology super well, but how does it really perform in a human? So the technology is really key. I kind of made an assumption people are finding these white spaces to get into, or these gray spaces in the interstices of existing products, and they're adding different features and benefits that make it differentiable in the marketplace.
What about the pros and cons of new product category versus existing product category? New product, of course, you don't have the competitive environment, but huge,
Right. And
persuasion case
it's
to make.
kind of springboarding off my last comment. A new category, you're also not, in addition to the idea that you're going to have to convince the FDA why you deserve to be on the marketplace with your data. If you're creating a new market, and I'm not a marketer, but I am. I've been doing this, for 36 years or whatever. You kind of know marketing as well. It's hard to go into virgin territory where you're actually convincing the docs of something that they don't really know they need yet. But you're then now talking about creating a whole market, and that is a whole bolus of money unto itself. When I was in the pharma industry, general counsel of pharma, those guys spend billions when they're creating a new market, they assail the market with, it's just amazing what they can do, including direct to consumer advertising and whatever else they do to soften the marketplace. Device companies don't have that kind of luxury. They don't have that kind of funding. They don't have those kind of margins. So, you got to think long and hard how do you now, if it's a great product, the adoption will come. It'll just be slow. You'll start with academic centers and great places like Mayo and Johns Hopkins and whatnot, and you'll grow slowly in concentric circles. But when you get an idea that's not so novel and it's in a crowded space, it's an easier pickup. But now you got to differentiate yourself vis-a-vis the competition,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the competitive sale that takes place. And how do you displace, a fully entrenched Boston Scientific or Abbott or Medtronic? It's tough to do.
So the communication strategy is key, not just in the commercialization stage, but pre-revenue. There are a lot of stakeholders that need to come along in their understanding and belief in your value proposition. How often do you find that the clients that you deal with are thinking in terms of their value proposition, not just ultimately to the end user or to the physician, the providers, but also to all the other stakeholders at every point along the way, that helping them understand the nature of the differentiation, the value bringing to the market, the market potential. How often do you think people are really prepared to articulate that in a persuasive way?
Sometimes it depends on the lineage of the CEO at that point and who they've hired, because if they maybe they came from marketing themselves and sales, they tend to understand that very well, and they'll get there quickly. If it's an engineer who's grown up through the ranks of the organization as an engineer and become an executive, and now is the CEO of a small company, they maybe are less attuned to that. They understand it, but so we find they're all over the place. We used to say, that in the pharmaceutical industry, marketing is king, and in the medical device industry, it used to be that sales is king. And so they're very different models of now it's less so sales because access is such a problem today. Getting access to, the big institutional hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of no see, no call docs, and you have to go through, management to, have an audience with anyone nowadays. But sales reps are still very important in the medical device industry. So, and they have a little more of a myopic view of how they attack. They have many marketing plans of their own, right? It's not an aggregate marketing plan. So this is where, John, folks like you guys come in. You can help people look at that holistically. It is going to be a composite of the marketing, but the cascading down into how does that translate into what individual sales reps do to take advantage of the marketing exposure and platform that you're creating. So, and I would behoove the audience to consider joining a group called the SMMG Group. Have you ever heard of them? Strategic Medical Marketing Group. You can go online and join them. I've been part of it for, over 15 years, maybe 18 years. And there are people like us, John, who just get on, who work. They're usually CEOs or VPs of marketing and sales or whatever, and we just get on, and we always have speakers there. It's the first Monday of every month, and the speakers are CEOs who tell their story, or it's maybe some marketer who said, here's how I got into that marketplace and was successful. I mean, we heard stories yesterday from Axonics, which was awesome to hear from that CEO telling his story. He was quite a storyteller, and he did some non-conventional things that his board didn't want him to do at some points in time, and yet he sort of, politely defied them, did his own thing, and was successful.
That's a great tip. The flip side of that initial question John had was the red flags question, and you could say, I suppose, just whatever the opposite, I guess, not having strong leadership, not having a game plan. But are there other red flags, like the thing that John said, where you see it and you've seen it before, and maybe it's a personality disposition of a founder CEO. Maybe it's their financial situation at a glance, and you can say this probably won't work. Are there some things where it's just a fairly easy judgment for you?
Yeah, inexperience and insecurity, and it's hard. You just it when you see it. And a lot of times I feel the role because I've been around the block so many times. I try and become like a confidant and an advisor, whether it's solicited or unsolicited. I just try and be really honest with my clients and help them understand, what. And I won't say this is what a good CEO would do. I'll just say, I know when I work with companies, a lot of times the next step is this or whatever, and I've kind of tried to lead them into next steps when I feel like they're just not there. They don't understand as well as they thought. There's somebody who has a lot of talent and wants to be a CEO, but maybe really isn't ready for prime time, but they're there right now. So, and it's usually inexperience and insecurity, and it's usually reflected. Sometimes they get overly assertive about things or aggressive, or sometimes you can tell they're deer in headlights would be too strong, but sometimes they just aren't quite sure what to do next. And, I just try and be gentle with them, trying to help them along and give them all the respect they're due, but help marshal them along the path. It's a tough job.
As I mentioned before, you've worked with over 1,340 clients over the last 30 years, many of them, pre-revenue and small startups. Could you share some, without naming names, could you share some stories of the challenges and triumphs with some of your clients?
There are so many experiences we've had, and usually the crises are born out of the failure to get that clearance or that de novo, or it's the failure to get the next tranche of financing, and then I'm going down with them at that point because they no longer have the funds that allow us to continue to help them. And that, that's a hard way to part, with a client when investor fatigue hits and they exhaust their funds. But it's just devising the game plan. We really work hard to help them think strategically and devise a game plan, because when you're working with the agency, and I'm sure it's a little different CMS. CMS is more of a black box with not a lot of rules. Talk about having to have relationships there. I don't like the CMS avenue is one dark tunnel to me. And but when you're with FDA, it's very it is relational, but it's very, they're very process oriented, and they have standards against which they make. It's really fun to come up with a strategy and help the company. For example, designing a clinical trial. The biggest thing we see with clients is they fail in communicating what study they're going to conduct, and somehow they're missing. We feel we're communications experts. We step in and help them communicate clearly. For example, most companies, I think they communicate in an inverted pyramid. They ramble, 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 and then they get to the point. And I learned from a media crisis manager when I was at 3M as general counsel, flip that pyramid around and get to the point, and support it with an increasingly widening base of information. So we're often trying to tell when you want to communicate with the FDA, first you got a young reviewer, and then you've got these middle managers and upper management. Get to the point. What is this device? What do you expect it to do? And why is there an unmet clinical need for it? And then let's talk about then the data that you're going to provide. And then have these honest dialogues with the agency, and don't pretend you're not hearing. The agency's pushing you one direction to do this. If it's crazy, you have to push back and fight. But if it's within the realm, now work with what they've given you to design the trial that will, they can embrace and you can conduct, and you can come out the other end. Because and the other thing that happens, John, and Kevin, is that clinical trials are messy. They're messy in the sense that, you're always going to have issues at the front end and maybe at the back end when you're reporting out your trial with the endpoints you've chosen, the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you have. There's going to be a lot of variables. There's going to be the performance goals that you select, the number of patients and how it's powered. And when you get done, your study is never going to be perfect. Yesterday, we heard one of the panelists talk about, he was a former physician and a venture capitalist, talk about just do the study. It's gotten really easy to go with the FDA. And I'm like, how then do we have so much work? Just taking how many appeals do we have to do for them? And what happens is things go wrong in trials. Somehow something messes up with the enrollment. The physicians aren't trained very well, and so they don't do so well on the test device. And the control always has an advantage because it's been out there forever, and now you're comparing yourself to a control, and the control actually surprises everyone because in the real world it's not doing that great, and that's why you want to do the study against them. But as it turns out, when you've got in a controlled clinical environment, because they've used it as a lot, it actually starts doing better in that when it reports out in the trial. So the test device is always at a disadvantage. You could miss a performance goal. You could choose the wrong performance goal. We've had so many issues with the agency at the tail end where it just didn't go swimmingly, and so we spend a lot of time with companies trying to help them figure that out so their path could be a lot smoother. And then choosing your pathway, whether it's a 510K or de novo, is really critical, and you really need to discuss that. And there's reasons to do one or the other. And so we spend a lot of time definitionally saying, for example, can you really meet the standard of a 510K? Do you have the same intended use? Do you have the same technological characteristics? And if you have different technological characteristics, which you're allowed to have under the 510K program, it's sufficiently flexible to accommodate technological innovation. Then you got to answer the third question, that is, do those different technological characteristics raise different questions of safety and effectiveness? Any one of those three can kick you off the 510K pathway, and we're really good at convincing FDA we've met those three and get to stay on that pathway. The one other thing I'll say is, do you really want to be a 510K if you're trying to get really enhanced reimbursement? So you might inherit a very pedestrian boilerplate intended use statement that will not garner you or your customer, the physician and the payer. It will not garner you the reimbursement you'd like to have. So you have to think that through.
So that's great to hear about, the triumphs and some of the red flags and the challenges. What I'd really like to know is, where is the industry going next? I mean, you've talked a little bit about the evolution of the regulatory ecosystem. You've talked a little bit about, the success and challenges, the unique characteristics that make a medtech startup successful. Where is it all going? What do you think the important things are to pay attention to in the next season of time here?
Well, that's a big question. It's a good question. So I think, the payment for devices, how are devices, going to get paid for? It's an increasingly, and we're talking, and for example, and how are clinical studies going to be conducted? In a post-COVID world, there is a lot of competition, especially with the pharmaceutical companies who are inflating what it costs to conduct a clinical trial. So increasingly, whereas FDA escalates its data requirements, 510Ks, for example, don't always and shouldn't always require human clinical data, but when they do, you're going to jump into a very competitive pool for those patients. That's becoming very difficult for a lot. In fact, Brian Feldhaus, next door to me here, is one of my vice presidents. He negotiates a lot of clinical trial agreements for medical device companies, and and the reason they're hiring us to do them is it's getting very competitive to get those resources. You need to know people who know what they're doing to get those clinical trial contracts through the process quickly. That's one thing. And I think the payer, where this all goes with the payer, because increasingly, there's a trend toward, let's go with Medtronic or Boston Sci because they have this entire portfolio of products, and we can negotiate with them and they can be our exclusive provider. And that squeezes a lot of people out. And when you change the ecosystem like that, because Medtronic, all these big companies, Zimmer Biomet, all these big companies, increasingly they are not organically coming up with the new technological evolutions. They're coming up with modifications to their current legacy platforms, and they're good modifications, but they're extensions of what they already make. When their companies want to get into new spaces, like J&J is recently getting back into cardiovascular, they're acquiring it wholesale. And what are they doing? They're acquiring small and medium-sized companies because they want to get into different therapeutic segments and different niches, et cetera. And that's and so when all the technology and all evolve, all the new technological innovation evolves out of small companies, if the ecosystem otherwise is squeezing them out because the cost of capital, which is a big issue, the cost of clinical trials to execute, the fact that payers are squeezing at the other end, so the margins are shrinking, it all comes into play. It's getting to be a more and more difficult environment. This is why I don't think people should acquiesce so willingly to where FDA is headed with data requirements. We have the least burdensome statute, which Congress enacted and amended twice, that said, you got to ask for the minimum necessary amount of information in order that would get this product to the marketplace. And so you really need to think about it, FDA. Don't just make this an academic exercise. Boy, I'd really like to study this. And this device presents an opportunity for me to ask for this mountain of data, as opposed to this nugget of data that is really needed in order to get the product to the market. So it's just a tsunami of stuff. I'm very optimistic here, short term, medium to long term. It's just gonna get tougher. We're gonna need medical devices, and the interface between medical devices and biologics and drugs will become even bigger as we go on. And so maybe it's the pharma industry that ends up having to fund all this, but the VCs are going to have to stay strong and be willing to put up more money to get a device through FDA and get it reimbursed by CMS.
I'm thinking, based on what you just said, we were talking a lot about like putting your foot on the gas to accelerate forward with the business. What are some indicators that you should put your foot on the brake? And specifically when you're talking about kind of that M&A component where the big strategics are like sucking up businesses, probably in not favorable, the founders that start these things aren't thinking this is where I'm going to end up. And they maybe increasingly get squeezed into a corner to where you're desperate. With that in mind, how can you anticipate or have foresight when considering entering into a market segment to introduce something where, if you just thought it through, you'd say, wait a second, I'm going to end up somewhere that's going to leave me very vulnerable. This is not the best market opportunity for us to pursue. Let's rethink this and enter somewhere else. what are the things that you could kind of reverse engineer from that bad moment in the future? Not saying they're all bad, because obviously there's sometimes when those acquisitions can be really great and a relief, but how can you back up in time and have that foresight so you don't end up going in a direction that you're going to regret later?
Well, I'm not a startup CEO nor a VC, but one of the speakers talked about failing fast, and that's a term of art that came into being about 35 years ago, but it's coming to the fore again. Another guy said it was, which I think it's really learning fast. Learning fast when that you're failing and it's not going to work, and just being honest with your board and maybe exiting quickly, because it's hard to string people along in their capital, and maybe they can pivot onto a similar or like device in that category. But I think it's a category. The selection of the device is really critical. Look how much time and effort VCs spend, winnowing down a funnel of candidates down to what they really want to put money into. It takes a lot of time and effort. So what you're asking is a big science and a big art that this little mind is not capable of answering. But I do think that a lot of these CEOs really, I've seen it every once in a while, they get into a market and they're like, wow, I thought this was going to be easy because it was a simple device, and FDA is making it's a tortured path. And other times they come with a very complex device, knowing going to be complex, but it gets elongated and protracted even more than they would have ever contemplated. So I think it's just trying to really be realistic about those product choices going in, and knowing that some of them aren't going to hit. I mean, the other thing I was going to talk about is just the emphasis today on fantastic data. Spend more money than you would normally think, because that's what the strategics want. What strategics like about small companies is, when I was in-house at 3M and Medtronic, if you come with a new technology and you're going to try and take it through the FDA and get CMS reimbursement, you have all the skill set to do that, but you have the company overlay that slows you down so much. You got to send it to this committee and within your neuro group, and do you want them to continue, and what kind of funding you get? Show us your budget, et cetera. You lose all the advantage of speed, and you drive out a lot of really creative people who can't stand to operate like that. So why big companies love to invest in small companies and sit in advisory roles on their board is they just get to monitor technology and let them do it at the speed at which they can do it. And they can lower the cost, because they'll argue with the FDA that this study is too big, et cetera. And then they'll get the product out the chute much faster than if they buy the device too early. That's why I think they like buying devices that are later stage, where the company's actually taking it through for the clearance or the approval, and then they'll take over at the commercialization end. Some companies, big companies, even like to see a bit of commercialization first. I think a lot of big companies would love to take it over at the commercialization stage because they feel that they can do it better.
Right. So as we close out here, Mark, I want to thank you for your time. This has been a great conversation. I wanted to ask you about advice you might offer for first-time med tech founders who are thinking of entering this space. What's the words of wisdom that you have for them?
Well, first of all, they're probably going to know a lot more than me. But if I don't know, maybe it's their first time, I can give them some advice. Always, select the best team that you can and stay close to your investors, but don't be driven by your board, because sometimes the board is going to drive you to places that aren't a winning strategy. They might think too conventionally. They might be risk averse. So just be careful about that. But from my vantage point as a advice provider, and there's a number of us out there that you're going to have to hire in the early stages because you won't be able to assemble the full team as you need it. You'll rely a lot on consultants. Treat us as part of the family. Treat us as, the CEOs who really embrace us and are close to us and bring us under the kimono and help us understand where they want to go and what they want to do. We love serving you. We love serving those people because we just feel dedicated to helping them succeed. And some CEOs do this so well. I'd say a good 70% do this really well. Other 30% don't do so hot. And you don't want to serve those people because you don't feel, you're like they're calling you in a crisis mode all the time. Can you be quick and dirty? when it can't be a quick and dirty, and it's just short-sighted, I think, to operate that way. So that's maybe my parting thought for those folks, because we all are humans at the other end, like you, and the more you make us feel part of it, the more we're going to give you our very, very best, and we're going to do it quickly because we know you have timelines to achieve.
That's awesome. I really enjoyed this episode, getting to know you over the last half year or so. And I think the audience is going to really benefit from the insights and advice that you've brought to this interview today. So thanks a lot for being on the show.
John, thank you, and Kevin. It's been good getting to know you guys as well. It's I just didn't understand who is LENKER and what is it you do. It's been great for us. So I'm sure there'll be many collaborations going forward.
Hopefully you enjoyed that episode. I'm sure we'll talk to Mark again. To learn more about Mark's work, visit DuValFDAlaw.com. That's DuValFDAlaw.com. And if you learned something today, then leave a rating and review wherever you're listening, and hit the follow button to be notified of new episodes. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you soon.